Hey guys, tonight we're exploring the nature of a trap. Not the kind with steel jaws hidden in the leaves, but the kind that is built from words, from fear, and from a set of instructions. We're delving into a story where the lines between victim and accomplice, free will and coercion, become so hopelessly blurred that even after all these years, no one is quite sure who was pulling the strings. It's a case that begins with one of the most mundane acts imaginable, a pizza delivery, and spirals into one of the most bizarre and diabolical criminal plots in modern history. This is a story that forces us to confront an unsettling question. How much of what we do is our own choice when we are under duress? It's a journey into a world of intricate, cruel games, where a human being becomes a pawn and a puzzle with a life or death deadline. It's a mystery that unfolded live on television, leaving behind a trail of baffling clues and a cast of characters so strange they seem to have been pulled from a dark, forgotten novel. Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to think about a simple instruction you followed today without a second thought. A traffic signal, a recipe, a note from a coworker. We live in a world guided by these small directives. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're ready to see what happens when those instructions are twisted into something truly monstrous. It helps this community grow and allows these complex histories to be shared and examined. And on that note, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from tonight. Seeing where these stories land is always a powerful reminder of our shared, late-night curiosity. Now settle in. Dim the lights. Let's unravel tonight's journey together. The pizza bomber heist the afternoon of August 28, 2003, was a warm, unremarkable late summer day in Erie, Pennsylvania. At Mamma Mia's Pizzeria, a 46-year-old delivery driver named Brian Wells was going about his usual routine. Wells was a quiet, somewhat solitary man who had worked as a pizza delivery driver for over a decade. He was known for being reliable and for his meticulous, almost obsessive attention to a few specific delivery routes. He was a man of simple habits, living a life that was, by all accounts, completely ordinary. Shortly before 2 p.m., a call came into the pizzeria. The customer wanted 2 sausage and pepperoni pizzas delivered to a remote address, 8631 Peach Street. The address was not a house, but a dirt access road that led to a local television transmission tower. The pizzeria owner later recalled that the voice on the phone sounded calm and normal. Brian Wells took the delivery and set off in his Geo Metro. It was a routine call that would be his last. About an hour later, at 2:38 p.m., Brian Wells walked into a PNC Bank branch in a nearby shopping plaza. His appearance was anything but ordinary. He was holding a strange, cane-shaped object that looked like a homemade shotgun, and around his neck was a large, bulky metal collar with a 3-digit lock on the front. It looked like a bizarre medieval torture device. He was balding, slightly overweight, and had a look on his face that was not one of confident menace, but of a strange, fearful urgency. He walked up to a teller and slid a note across the counter. The note was demanding and specific. Gather employees with access to the vault and have them open it and fill a duffel bag with $250,000. It began. The note warned that the device around his neck was a bomb, that it was armed, and that it could be detonated at any time by him or by remote control. The note was long and detailed, outlining a series of complex instructions. The bank employees, terrified, complied as best they could. They explained that they didn't have access to the vault on such short notice and could only give him the cash from the teller drawers. Wells took a bag filled with just over $8,700, a fraction of what he had demanded. He then got an orange lollipop from the counter, put it in his mouth, and walked out of the bank. He got back into his car and drove away. The entire robbery had taken less than 15 minutes. The bank manager had already called 911, and police were alerted. At 3:04 p.m., just a few minutes after he left the bank, Pennsylvania state troopers spotted Wells's Geo Metro and pulled him over in a nearby parking lot. The scene that followed was one of the most surreal and tragic confrontations in modern police history, and it was captured live on local news cameras. The police, guns drawn, ordered Wells out of his car. He complied, got out, and sat down on the pavement in front of his vehicle. He immediately told the officers that the bomb was real and that he had been forced to rob the bank. "I don't have a lot of time," he pleaded with them. "It's going to go off." He explained that he had been accosted by a group of black men who had clamped the bomb around his neck, held him at gunpoint, and forced him to rob the bank. He said they were watching him and would detonate the bomb if he didn't cooperate. The troopers, faced with a man who was both a bank robbery suspect and a potential bomb victim, were in an impossible situation. They took cover behind their patrol cars, secured the perimeter, and called for the bomb squad. They treated Wells as a suspect, not a victim. For the next 20 agonizing minutes, Brian Wells sat on the hot asphalt, surrounded by police, his life hanging in the balance. He grew increasingly desperate. "Why isn't anybody trying to get this thing off me?" he cried out. He told them about a set of instructions he had been given, a kind of scavenger hunt he was supposed to complete to find keys and codes to disarm the device. He insisted he was telling the truth. The bomb squad was still en route. The officers on the scene were not trained to deal with explosive devices and were following protocol by waiting. At 3:18 p.m., just 3 minutes before the bomb squad arrived, the device around Brian Wells's neck began to emit a series of soft beeps. Wells's frantic pleas turned to a final, resigned statement. "I'm not lying," he said. And then the bomb detonated. The explosion was powerful and violent, killing him instantly and shocking the officers and the television viewers who were watching the surreal drama unfold live. The aftermath of the explosion left investigators with a scene of almost unbelievable strangeness. The bomb was a sophisticated, handmade device, a hinged metal collar packed with pipe bombs and connected to a complex system of timers and anti-tamper switches. The cane gun was also a clever, homemade weapon. This was not the work of an amateur. But the most baffling discovery was made inside Wells's car. There, police found a 9-page, handwritten document. It was a set of incredibly detailed and complex instructions, addressed to the bomb hostage. The document laid out a diabolical game. It was a scavenger hunt that Wells was supposed to complete after the robbery. He was instructed to follow a series of precise directions to various remote locations around Erie, where he would find clues and keys that would ultimately lead to the disarming of the bomb. The instructions were taunting and cruel. "There is only one way you can survive, and that is to cooperate completely," one page read. "This powerful, booby-trapped bomb can be removed only by following our instructions." As investigators began to analyze the scavenger hunt, they realized the sheer cruelty of the plot. The timeline laid out in the notes was impossible to complete. The journey would have taken hours, but the bomb was on a timer that gave Wells less than an hour from the time he left the bank. He never had a chance. The game was rigged from the start. He was a dead man from the moment the collar was clamped around his neck. The case was now a complex homicide investigation, but who was the victim and who was the perpetrator? Was Brian Wells a completely innocent man, a random pizza delivery driver who was ambushed and turned into a human bomb against his will? Or was he a willing participant in the robbery plot, a co-conspirator who believed the bomb was fake, only to be double-crossed by his partners in crime? This central question, victim or accomplice, would become the core of the entire mystery. His family insisted he was an innocent victim, a gentle, simple man who would never be involved in such a violent crime. But investigators found details in his life that were troubling. He was known to associate with some unsavory characters, and some friends claimed he had complained about not having enough money. The police were divided. The scene in the parking lot, his desperate pleas for help, seemed to paint a clear picture of a terrified victim. But his calm demeanor during the robbery itself was strange. And how could the plotters have known he would be the one to deliver the pizzas to that remote location? The FBI took over the case, which they code-named Collar Bomb. They were faced with a mystery that had no precedent. They had a dead man who was both a bank robber and a homicide victim. They had a diabolical, handmade bomb. And they had a set of cryptic, handwritten instructions for a deadly game that couldn't be won. They had no idea who the masterminds were. The scavenger hunt notes were the only roadmap they had, and they hoped that by following the trail laid out for Brian Wells, they might find their way to the brilliant, sadistic architect of one of the most complex and bizarre crimes they had ever encountered. The gruesome, televised death of Brian Wells was only the beginning of the FBI's descent into a labyrinth of bizarre clues, psychological manipulation, and a cast of characters so strange and damaged they seemed to have been pulled from a Southern Gothic novel. The investigation, codenamed Collar Bomb, became a painstaking effort to deconstruct one of the most diabolical plots in American criminal history. The central question that drove the early days of the inquiry was the role of Brian Wells himself. Was he a truly innocent victim, tragically chosen at random? Or was he a willing, if perhaps naive, participant in a plan that went horribly wrong? The theory that Wells was a co-conspirator gained traction early on. Investigators found it difficult to believe that such a complex plot could have been executed on a complete stranger. The plotters would have had to know that Wells would be the one to answer the call from the pizzeria, that he would be alone, and that they could subdue him at the remote delivery location. It seemed more likely that Wells was in on the plan, at least to some degree. The working theory became that Wells had agreed to participate in the bank robbery, believing the bomb collar was a fake, a convincing prop designed to ensure the bank employees complied and to provide him with a plausible story of duress if he were caught. In this scenario, his co-conspirators had betrayed him, strapping a live bomb to his neck instead of a dummy, either to ensure his silence or as part of a crueler, more complex scheme. His behavior inside the bank lent some credence to this theory. Eyewitnesses described him as strangely calm and almost casual. He walked with a noticeable limp, which police later determined was due to the homemade cane gun he was trying to conceal. His use of the lollipop was particularly baffling. It was an act of nonchalance that seemed completely at odds with a person who believed they had a live bomb strapped to their neck. However, prosecutors would later argue that this was the behavior of a man in deep shock, his mind unable to fully process the terror of his situation. The debate over his complicity would rage for years. With the role of Wells uncertain, the FBI turned their focus to the intricate, handwritten scavenger hunt notes found in his car. They were the only direct communication from the plot's mastermind. The notes were a roadmap not just for Wells, but for the investigation itself. Agents began to follow the trail. The first clue led them to a small container hidden under a rock near the bank. This was as far as Wells had gotten. The subsequent clues led them on a winding, nonsensical path through Erie County, to remote wooded areas and obscure landmarks. The trail was a masterclass in misdirection, designed to be impossible to complete in the allotted time. It was clear the author was intelligent, meticulous, and deeply sadistic. The investigation remained frustratingly stalled for weeks. Then, on September 20th, 2003, less than a month after the heist, a crucial tip came into the Pennsylvania State Police. A man named Bill Rothstein called to report a body hidden in a freezer at his home. The home was located on Peach Street, the same road as the transmission tower where Brian Wells had been sent to deliver the pizzas. When police arrived at Rothstein's house, he was cooperative and strangely calm. He led them to the freezer. Inside, they found the frozen body of a man named James Roden, who was Rothstein's ex-girlfriend's current boyfriend. Rothstein told the police a bizarre and convoluted story. He claimed that his ex-girlfriend, a woman named Marjorie Deal Armstrong, had shot and killed Roden in a dispute over money. He said that she had then paid him $2,000 to help her hide the body and clean up the crime scene. He claimed he had kept the body in his freezer because he was afraid of her and was trying to figure out what to do. The story was strange, but the discovery of a body was a major development. But then, Rothstein did something that electrified the investigators. He handed them a handwritten suicide note. He claimed he had written it because he was contemplating taking his own life due to his involvement in the Roden murder and his fear of Marjorie. The note, however, contained a stunning, cryptic final line. "This has nothing to do with the Wells case." The unsolicited denial was a massive red flag. Why would a man, in a suicide note related to a completely separate murder, feel the need to explicitly deny any connection to the most high-profile crime in the state? It was, for the FBI, the moment the two seemingly separate cases, the pizza bomber heist and the body in the freezer murder, collided. They were now convinced that Bill Rothstein and Marjorie Deal Armstrong were at the center of the collar bomb plot. The two individuals they were now focused on were unlike any criminal suspects they had encountered before. Bill Rothstein was a handyman and a former high school shop teacher. Known for being eccentric and reclusive, he was intelligent but socially awkward. Marjorie Deal Armstrong was a far more complex and volatile character. She was a woman of exceptional intelligence, a former straight-A student who had earned a master's degree and was once a respected member of the community. But she was also profoundly, mentally ill. She suffered from severe bipolar disorder with manic and hoarding tendencies, and her life had been a long, slow descent into paranoia, rage, and criminal activity. She had a history of failed relationships, and several of her previous boyfriends had died under mysterious circumstances. She was manipulative, cunning, and capable of extreme violence. Investigators believed that Rothstein and Deal Armstrong were the masterminds, but they needed to figure out how Brian Wells fit into their twisted world. The connection they discovered was another man, Kenneth Barnes. Barnes was a retired television repairman, a fishing buddy of Marjorie's, and a known drug dealer and police informant. When questioned, Barnes, hoping for leniency on other drug charges, began to talk. He painted a picture of a conspiracy that was even more bizarre and convoluted than the FBI could have imagined. According to Barnes, the mastermind of the entire plot was Marjorie Deal Armstrong. He claimed her motive was a twisted form of revenge and greed. Her father, a man named Harold Deal, was a wealthy and frugal man who had amassed a small fortune. Marjorie was convinced that her father was wasting his money and was determined to get her inheritance before he died. The bank robbery, Barnes claimed, was Marjorie's plan to get enough money to hire a hitman to kill her father. Barnes laid out the cast of characters. He said Marjorie had enlisted him to help with the plot. She had also brought in Bill Rothstein, her former fiancé, whose mechanical skills were needed to construct the complex bomb collar. The final piece of the puzzle was Brian Wells. According to Barnes, Wells was not a random victim. He was a willing participant. Barnes claimed that Wells, who was known to associate with prostitutes, had been introduced to the plot through Kenneth Barnes himself. He said that Wells was deeply involved in the planning stages of the robbery. He believed the bomb was a fake and that the elaborate scavenger hunt was just part of the ruse to convince police he was a hostage. The plot, as described by Barnes, was a Rube Goldberg machine of criminal intent. Marjorie was the architect, driven by her desire to kill her father. Rothstein was the engineer building the devices. Barnes was the middleman connecting the players. And Wells was the pawn, the bomb hostage who would carry out the robbery. But why did it all go so wrong? Barnes claimed that just days before the heist was set to take place, the co-conspirators had a falling out. James Roden, Marjorie's then-boyfriend, had discovered the plot and was threatening to go to the police. This led to the confrontation where Marjorie, in a fit of rage, shot and killed him. This unexpected murder sent the entire plan into a panicked tailspin. According to Barnes, it was at this point that the plot changed. The original plan may have been for Wells to survive, but with Roden dead and the plot compromised, the others decided that Wells had to be silenced. The bomb was made real. The scavenger hunt was made impossible. Brian Wells was no longer a co-conspirator. He was a loose end that needed to be eliminated. This narrative, provided primarily by Kenneth Barnes, seemed to explain everything. It connected the collar bomb heist to the body in the freezer murder. It explained the motive, the means, and the bizarre cast of characters. It also definitively painted Brian Wells as a willing participant who was ultimately betrayed. Marjorie Deal Armstrong and Bill Rothstein, however, told very different stories. Rothstein, before his death from cancer in 2004, stuck to his story that Marjorie was the sole killer of James Roden and that he knew nothing about the Wells case. Marjorie, for her part, claimed that she was completely innocent of everything. She insisted that Bill Rothstein was the true mastermind of the collar bomb plot and that he had murdered James Roden to silence him. She claimed Rothstein had tried to frame her for everything because she had rejected him. She admitted to knowing Brian Wells but claimed her involvement was minimal. The FBI was now faced with a he said, she said, he said scenario with three deeply unreliable narrators: a convicted felon, a diagnosed manic depressive, and a dead man, all pointing fingers at each other. The only person who could have clarified the truth of his own involvement Brian Wells, was dead. The case was a tangled knot of lies, mental illness, and manipulation. The FBI believed they knew the who: Marjorie Diehl Armstrong, Kenneth Barnes, and the deceased Bill Rothstein. But proving it and sorting out the exact roles each person played in the diabolical scheme would be one of the greatest challenges they had ever faced. The strange, cruel intelligence behind the plot was undeniable, but its source was lost in a fog of conflicting confessions and a chorus of mad, unreliable voices. The Murders of Charles Rogers, the Pizza Bomber case, is a journey into a world of diabolical complexity and psychological manipulation. A crime built like a deadly machine. But some of the most unsettling crimes are not complex at all. They are brutal, primal, and seem to erupt from a place of deep, unknowable rage. This is a story that begins not with a plot, but with a postcard, a mundane communication that would be the last sign of life from a quiet, elderly couple. The silence that followed would eventually be broken by a horrific discovery, revealing a crime of shocking brutality hidden within the respectable confines of a wealthy, secluded neighborhood. This is the story of the strange life and bloody end of the Charles Rogers case. Houston, Texas, in the summer of 1965, was a city of oil money, ambition, and sprawling, leafy suburbs. The neighborhood of Montrose was one of its most desirable, a place of stately homes and old money families. It was here, in a large, comfortable house at 2210 Jackson Boulevard, that 79-year-old Fred Rogers and his 72-year-old wife, Edwina, lived. They were a quiet, elderly couple, well regarded by their neighbors, living out their golden years in peace. They shared their home with their only son, 43-year-old Charles Rogers. Charles was an enigma, a man who lived a life of deep and baffling contradictions. He was, by all accounts, brilliant. He held degrees in geology and nuclear physics and had served as a pilot in the Civil Air Patrol during World War II. After the war, he worked for a time as a seismologist for Shell Oil and later as a geophysicist, traveling the world on various projects. He was fluent in several languages and possessed a genius-level IQ. But despite his intellectual gifts, Charles was a social recluse. He was intensely private, unmarried, and had few, if any, close friends. In recent years, he had moved back in with his elderly parents, living a quiet, almost invisible existence in their large home. Neighbors rarely saw him. He was a man of immense potential who had, for reasons unknown, retreated from the world. He was also, it was later discovered, a man in deep financial trouble, having lost a significant amount of money in various failed business ventures. The story of the crime begins on June 20th, 1965. It was Father's Day. Fred and Edwina's nephew received a postcard from them. It was a simple, friendly note wishing him well. It would be the last communication anyone ever received from the couple. In the days that followed, neighbors noticed that the Rogers house had gone quiet. The mail began to pile up, and the newspapers were left uncollected on the lawn. This was unusual for the meticulous couple. Concerned, one of the neighbors called the Houston Police Department to request a welfare check. On June 23rd, a police officer was dispatched to the home on Jackson Boulevard. He knocked on the door but got no answer. He peered through the windows and saw that the dining room table was set for a meal that had never been eaten. A sense of unease settled over him. He tried the doors and found them all locked. Unable to gain entry, and with no overt signs of a crime, he left, planning to return later. The next day, the concerned nephew, having not been able to reach his aunt and uncle by phone, decided to drive to the house himself. He arrived to find the mail still piled up. He too was unable to get inside. Now seriously alarmed, he called the police again. This time, 2 officers responded. They broke a pane of glass on a side door and entered the house. The scene inside was one of eerie stillness and strange order. There were no signs of a struggle or a robbery. Valuables were in plain sight, but the house was empty. The officers began a room-by-room search. When they opened the door to the kitchen refrigerator, they were met with a sight of almost unimaginable horror. Neatly stacked on the shelves of the refrigerator were large, professionally butchered cuts of meat, wrapped in butcher paper. It was immediately clear that this was not beef or pork. It was human remains. A further search of the kitchen revealed a bloody, 18-inch crosscut saw. In the vegetable crisper, the officers found the severed heads of Fred and Edwina Rogers. The crime scene was one of shocking, calculated brutality. The police determined that the couple had been bludgeoned to death with a claw hammer, likely in their upstairs bedroom. Their bodies had then been dragged to the bathroom, where they were meticulously dismembered in the bathtub. The killer had then drained their bodies of blood and dissected their internal organs, flushing them down the toilet. The remaining flesh and bone had been cut into manageable pieces, wrapped, and stored in the refrigerator. It was a crime of almost unbelievable savagery, yet it had been carried out with a strange, almost surgical precision. The killer had even taken the time to clean the bathroom, leaving it almost spotless. The immediate and only suspect was the couple's reclusive son, Charles Rogers. He was the only other person living in the house, and he was now missing. A manhunt was immediately launched. The police believed they were hunting for a brilliant but deeply disturbed man who had committed an act of horrific patricide and matricide. As investigators began to piece together Charles's movements, they discovered that his parents had likely been killed on or around June 20th, the day they sent the postcard. This meant that for several days, Charles had likely been living in the house with the dismembered remains of his parents stored in the kitchen refrigerator. The thought was chilling. A man of genius-level intellect going about his daily routine in a house that he had turned into a charnel house. The search for Charles Rogers became a national story. He was a geophysicist who had access to planes and was fluent in multiple languages, making him an exceptionally difficult fugitive to track. The police theorized that he had likely fled to Mexico, a country he knew well from his previous work. Sightings of him were reported from all over the world, from Mexico City to South America, but none were ever confirmed. He seemed to have vanished without a trace. As the investigation deepened, a more complex and bizarre picture of Charles Rogers began to emerge, one that went far beyond the simple narrative of a disturbed man who had snapped. Investigators uncovered evidence that suggested Charles was not just a reclusive academic, but may have been living a secret life involving international intrigue and espionage. They found shortwave radio equipment in his room, which he could have used to communicate secretly. They learned that he had connections to various figures in the intelligence community, and that his geological work had often taken him to politically sensitive areas. This led to a stunning alternative theory for the murders. Was it possible that Charles Rogers was not the killer, but a victim himself? Could his parents have been collateral damage in a professional hit carried out by foreign agents or shadowy government figures who were trying to silence Charles? In this scenario, the killers had murdered his parents and then abducted Charles, staging the scene to make it look like he was the perpetrator. The extreme, almost surgical dismemberment of the bodies was unusual for a crime of passion committed by a family member. It seemed more like the work of trained professionals trying to create a gruesome and confusing crime scene. This theory was bolstered by the fact that Charles, despite his financial troubles, had never touched his parents' considerable savings. His motive for killing them for money seemed weak, as he didn't take any of it. The idea that this brilliant, quiet man was secretly a spy, a player in the high-stakes games of the Cold War, seemed almost too fantastic to be true. And yet, the alternative, that he had butchered his own parents with a claw hammer and a saw, was almost too horrific to comprehend. The Houston Police Department, for their part, never wavered from their belief that Charles was the killer. They officially declared him wanted for murder, and the case remained open. But as the years turned into decades, Charles Rogers was never found. No body was ever recovered. No credible sightings were ever confirmed. He had simply disappeared from the face of the earth, leaving behind a refrigerator full of his butchered parents and a legacy of profound and disturbing questions. Was he a cold, calculating killer who committed the perfect crime and escaped justice? Or was he the victim of a dark conspiracy, a brilliant man who got in over his head and was erased by forces far more powerful than the local police? The answer lies somewhere in the silence that descended upon the house on Jackson Boulevard, a silence that has never been broken. The hunt for Charles Rogers became one of the most extensive and enduring manhunts in Texas history. The Houston Police Department, convinced that he was the sole perpetrator of the gruesome murders of his parents, cast a wide net. They issued an all-points bulletin and placed him on the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitives list. His photograph and description were circulated internationally, with a particular focus on Mexico and Central America, where his work as a geophysicist had made him familiar with the terrain and the culture. For years, every reported sighting of a man fitting his description, from a dusty cantina in Mexico to a remote village in Guatemala, was diligently followed up, but each lead turned into a dead end. Charles Rogers had achieved a state of near-perfect invisibility. In the absence of a suspect, the investigation turned inward, with detectives and journalists trying to build a psychological profile of a man who could commit such an act. The picture that emerged was one of a deeply troubled and fractured individual. Charles was a man of immense intellectual gifts who was, by all accounts, complete social failure. He was unable to maintain friendships or romantic relationships. His professional life, which had started with so much promise, had disintegrated into a series of failed ventures and financial ruin. He was, at 43 years old, living back at home with his parents, a situation that must have been a source of profound daily humiliation for a man of his intelligence and former ambition. This led to the primary psychological theory for the crime, a long-simmering rage that had finally boiled over. Investigators speculated that years of resentment towards his parents, whom he may have blamed for his failures or felt controlled by, had built up to a breaking point. The motive was not financial gain, but a final, explosive act of rebellion against the perceived source of his life's disappointments. The argument could have been over something as trivial as a meal, but it would have been the final spark on a mountain of dry tinder. In this scenario, the extreme, almost ritualistic violence of the dismemberment was an expression of the sheer depth of his rage, a desire to not just kill, but to completely annihilate the figures of his parents. His scientific, methodical mind would have then taken over, leading him to perform the gruesome task with a chilling, detached precision. However, the alternative theory that Charles Rogers was not the killer but a victim of a much larger conspiracy refused to die. This narrative was championed by several independent investigators and authors, most notably the journalist and true crime writer John Jack Rice. Rice spent years digging into Rogers's past and uncovered a web of connections and coincidences that were too strange to ignore. Rice's investigation suggested that Rogers's work as a geophysicist was often a cover for his activities as a contract agent for the CIA. In the high-stakes environment of the Cold War, geologists and geophysicists were valuable assets, their work providing a legitimate reason to be in politically sensitive and remote areas of the world. Rice found evidence that Rogers had connections to individuals involved in the anti-Castro movement and other shadowy intelligence operations. The most explosive part of this theory connects Charles Rogers directly to one of the most significant events in American history, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. This theory posits that Rogers may have been one of the shadowy figures involved in the conspiracy, perhaps acting as a pilot or a communications expert for the plotters. The two key figures in the JFK assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, both had known connections to organized crime figures with ties to the anti-Castro movement. The theory suggests that in the years following the assassination, the architects of the plot began to systematically eliminate anyone who knew too much, to tie up all the loose ends. In this narrative, Charles Rogers was a loose end. The murder of his parents was a professional hit, carried out by intelligence operatives or mob hitmen to get to him. The extreme brutality was a deliberate signature, a warning to others. The scene was then staged to perfectly frame Charles as the killer, providing an ideal cover story for his own disappearance. He was either killed at the same time as his parents and his body disposed of elsewhere, or he was abducted and eliminated later. The postcard sent on Father's Day could have been sent by the killers themselves to establish a false timeline. This theory, while sensational, did have some circumstantial evidence to support it. A ham radio operator who knew Rogers claimed that on the night of the JFK assassination, he had overheard Rogers engaging in a strange, coded conversation on the radio, using call signs that were not officially registered. The conversation, he claimed, was triumphant and celebratory. This story, however, is purely anecdotal and has never been independently verified. Another piece of the puzzle came from Rogers's own cryptic statements to the few people he did talk to. He had reportedly told a business associate that he was involved in dangerous work and that he feared for his life. This could be interpreted as a sign of his involvement in the intelligence world, or it could simply be another manifestation of a developing paranoid delusion. The Houston Police Department has always publicly dismissed the conspiracy theories as fantasy. They maintain that the evidence points overwhelmingly to Charles Rogers as the sole perpetrator. They cite the fact that there was no forced entry into the home, suggesting the killer was someone who lived there. The murder weapon was a common claw hammer from inside the house, and the most logical explanation for his disappearance is that he successfully fled and created a new life for himself under an assumed identity. In 1975, 10 years after the murders, a court officially declared Charles Rogers dead in absentia at the request of his relatives, allowing his and his parents' estates to be settled. But the official declaration did little to quell the speculation. The case remained a fixture of Houston lore. Then, in the 1990s, the case took another strange twist. A forensic anthropologist, using the then-new techniques of facial reconstruction and age progression, created a bust of what Charles Rogers might look like in his 70s. The image was broadcast on television shows like America's Most Wanted. The broadcast generated a flood of new tips, including several from people in Mexico who were convinced they knew a man who matched the description, an elderly American expatriate living a quiet life. But again, these leads were investigated and ultimately led nowhere. The fate of Charles Rogers remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of the 20th century. Was he a brilliant psychopath who committed a perfect, grisly crime and then orchestrated a flawless escape? Did he spend the rest of his life living under a new name in a foreign country, a quiet old man with a monstrous secret? Or was he a pawn in a much larger, darker game, a man silenced by the very people he had worked for in the shadowy world of Cold War espionage? The two narratives are so wildly different, yet both are, in their own way, plausible. One is a story of a mind collapsing inward, the other a story of a secret world closing in. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle, or perhaps it is something else entirely. A secret that Charles Rogers took with him wherever he went. The house on Jackson Boulevard was eventually sold, its gruesome history slowly fading into the past. But the mystery endures, a chilling story about the darkness that can lurk behind the closed doors of a respectable home, and the terrifying possibility that a man of genius can use his intellect not to build, but to destroy, and then to simply vanish from the world. The death of Netta Fornario, the case of Charles Rogers, is a story steeped in violence and shrouded in the dark corridors of potential government conspiracy. But some mysteries are not about the schemes of men, but about the allure of a different kind of power, the power of ancient places, esoteric beliefs, and the unseen world. This is a story that unfolds not in a bustling city, but on a tiny, windswept, and legend-haunted island. It's the story of a woman who traveled across an ocean in search of magical enlightenment and found only a lonely, inexplicable death. This is the strange and mystical case of Netta Fornario. The Isle of Iona, off the western coast of Scotland, is a place that feels removed from time. It is a tiny island, just 3 miles long, known for its stark, breathtaking beauty and its profound spiritual significance. For centuries, it has been a center of Celtic Christianity, the home of a famous abbey founded by Saint Columba in the 6th century. But its spiritual history runs even deeper. Long before the Christians arrived, it was a sacred site for the Druids, a place of ancient power, believed to be a thin place where the veil between the physical world and the spiritual world is unusually permeable. It is a place that has always attracted pilgrims, mystics, and seekers of hidden knowledge. In the autumn of 1929, one such seeker arrived on Iona's shores. Her name was Netta Fornario. She was a woman of wealth and intellect, born in London to an Italian family. She had studied at prominent universities and was a member of several esoteric and magical societies in London. She was deeply involved in the occult revival that was sweeping through Europe at the time, a world of secret orders, complex rituals, and the pursuit of magical power. Specifically, she was a high-ranking initiate in a splinter group of the famous Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, an influential magical society that had once counted figures like Aleister Crowley and W.B. Yeats among its members. Netta had come to Iona for a reason. She believed the island's ancient energies were essential for her spiritual work. She rented a room in a small cottage and intended to spend the winter there, undertaking a solitary magical retreat. She planned to engage in deep meditation, perform complex rituals, and attempt to communicate with the spirits and elemental forces that she believed inhabited the island. To the local islanders, a small, close-knit community of Gaelic-speaking fishermen and crofters, she was a figure of intense curiosity and suspicion. They saw her as a strange, eccentric mainlander, often seen wandering the moors and hills alone, dressed in dark, flowing robes, seemingly lost in another world. For the first few weeks, her stay was uneventful. She kept to herself, writing in her journals and taking long, solitary walks. But as the winter nights grew longer and colder, her behavior became increasingly erratic and alarming. Her landlady, Mrs. McCrae, noted that Netta seemed to be in a state of growing fear and agitation. She spoke of being under psychic attack from other members of her magical order back in London. She believed they were trying to disrupt her work and harm her through telepathic means. She became convinced that she was not alone, that she was being hounded by entities that were both human and non-human. Her paranoia intensified. She began to rearrange the furniture in her room, believing certain configurations could offer magical protection. She told Mrs. McCrae that she could not be disturbed, as she was in a deep trance state and her soul had left her body to travel on the astral planes. She claimed that if she were roused suddenly, her silver cord, the mystical tether connecting her spirit to her body, could be severed, resulting in her instant death. The situation came to a head on the morning of November 17, 1929. Mrs. McCrae went to check on her tenant and found Netta in a state of extreme distress. She was packing her bags in a frenzy, her hands shaking. She announced that she had to leave the island immediately. She claimed that the psychic attacks had become too powerful and that her life was in danger. She spoke of messages and telepathic hypnotism being directed at her from London. She arranged for a boat to take her back to the mainland that very day. But then, just as suddenly as she had decided to leave, she changed her mind. Later that same afternoon, she seemed to have regained her composure. She told Mrs. McCrae that the danger had passed for the moment and that she had decided to stay on the island. She unpacked her bags and settled back into her room. That evening, she seemed calm, almost serene. She sat by the fire, talking with her landlady. It was the last time anyone would see her alive. The next morning, Mrs. McCrae noticed that Netta's bed had not been slept in. Her room was empty. She saw that the front door of the cottage was open, and a set of footprints led out into the dew-covered grass. Alarmed, she alerted the local constable. A search of the island was immediately organized. The small community of Iona, accustomed to a quiet and predictable life, was now faced with a missing person. The search did not last long. Later that day, a local man was walking across a desolate, windswept part of the island, near a small lock and an ancient megalithic stone circle known as a fairy mound, a place steeped in local folklore and believed to be a gateway to the otherworld. There, lying on the cold, damp ground, he found the body of Netta Fornario. The scene of her death was as strange and as ritualistic as her life had been. She was lying on her back, stretched out on a small, grassy mound that formed a crude cross. She was wearing only a thin, black silk robe, completely inadequate for the harsh November weather. Her feet were bare and badly cut and scratched, as if she had been running frantically across the rough terrain in the dark. Beside her body lay a large, sharp knife, but there were no stab wounds on her body. The ground around her was also marked with strange scratches and symbols, including a large cross that had been cut into the turf with the knife. But the most bizarre and inexplicable detail was her own body. The autopsy would later reveal that there was no discernible physical cause of death. She had not been stabbed or bludgeoned. There were no signs of a struggle with another person. She had not been poisoned. The coroner was completely baffled. He could only speculate that she had died from exposure to the cold, or perhaps from heart failure brought on by extreme terror. The official cause of death was left frustratingly vague. The mystery deepened when her personal belongings were examined. Her journals were filled with esoteric writings, magical symbols, and paranoid ramblings about the psychic attacks she believed she was enduring. She wrote about a specific magical order and its leader, a woman she seemed to both admire and fear. She believed this group was trying to control her mind from afar. Had her own paranoid delusions driven her to run out into the freezing night, where she performed a final, desperate ritual before succumbing to the elements? Or was there something more to her fears? The case of Netta Fornario was not just a question of how she died, but a question of what forces, human or otherwise, had led her to that lonely fairy mound on a cold and desolate night. The strange and ritualistic death of Netta Fornario on the Isle of Iona sent a ripple of unease through both the small island community and the esoteric circles of London. The official explanation that she had died from exposure or heart failure brought on by a psychotic episode was a neat and tidy conclusion, but it failed to satisfy those who knew the details of her life and the bizarre circumstances of her death. For many, the case was not a simple tragedy of mental illness, but a dark testament to the very real dangers of the magical world she inhabited. The investigation into her death focused heavily on her involvement with the Alpha Et Omega, a successor organization to the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This group was led by a charismatic and powerful woman named Moina Mathers, the widow of one of the Golden Dawn's founders. Netta had been a high-ranking member, a chief, but had recently had a falling out with Mathers. Her journals were filled with fearful references to Mathers, whom she believed was a powerful sorceress capable of directing psychic attacks across great distances. Netta believed that Mathers was angry with her for a perceived transgression and was using telepathic hypnotism and astral projection to torment her. This led to the most esoteric and sensational theory surrounding her death, that she was the victim of a genuine magical battle. Proponents of this theory believe that Netta was not suffering from paranoid delusions, but was accurately describing a real psychic assault. They argue that powerful occult practitioners can, and do, project their consciousness and will across space to affect others. In this narrative, Netta fled to Iona, a place of immense natural power, believing its sacred energies could act as a shield. The ritual she performed on the fairy mound was not an act of madness, but a desperate, final attempt at magical self-defense. The large cross cut into the turf and the knife laid beside her were not random symbols, but elements of a protective ritual designed to banish the hostile forces she believed were closing in. Her death, in this context, was the result of this magical duel. She either died from the sheer terror of the psychic onslaught, her heart giving out under the strain, or she was somehow killed directly by the magical energies directed at her. While this theory sounds like something from a fantasy novel, it was taken seriously by many within the occult community at the time. The famous occultist and writer Dion Fortune, who knew Netta, wrote about the case extensively. She was convinced that Netta had been killed by magical means and used the story as a cautionary tale in her book Psychic Self-Defense, which became a classic text on the subject. Fortune believed that Netta, in her solitary retreat, had made herself vulnerable and had been astrally executed by the magical order she had defied. A more grounded, but no less sinister, theory suggests that the psychic attacks were not supernatural at all, but very human. It's possible that Netta was not being attacked by telepathy, but was being harassed and intimidated by members of her former order through more conventional means. The messages she received could have been anonymous letters or coded threats. Her paranoia might have been rooted in a real-world campaign of intimidation. This theory suggests that someone from the order may have followed her to Iona. The presence of the knife at the scene, with no corresponding wounds on her body, is a particularly puzzling detail. If she was performing a ritual, it could have been a symbolic weapon. But if someone else was there, the knife could have been used to threaten and terrorize her, forcing her to flee into the night. This person could have chased her across the rough terrain, causing the cuts on her feet, until she finally collapsed from fear and exhaustion on the fairy mound. The killer could have then arranged the scene to look like a ritual suicide before disappearing, leaving the authorities to blame Netta's own eccentric beliefs for her death. This would be a clever and cruel way to commit a perfect, untraceable murder. Another possibility lies in the nature of her own psychological state. It is entirely possible that there was no external attacker, either human or psychic. Netta may have been suffering from a severe schizoaffective disorder or another form of psychosis. Her belief in magic and psychic phenomena could have provided the framework for her delusions. In this interpretation, her flight into the freezing night was a tragic symptom of her illness. The ritual she performed was real to her, a desperate attempt to fight the phantoms of her own mind. The cuts on her feet were simply the result of running blindly through the dark, unforgiving landscape. Her death was a sad and lonely end, a case of a vulnerable woman succumbing to the elements while in the grip of a profound mental health crisis. This is the most rational and medically plausible explanation, but for some, it still doesn't quite account for the sheer strangeness and specificity of the scene. A final, intriguing detail adds another layer to the mystery. After her death, it was discovered that Netta Fornario was wearing a silver chain around her neck, from which hung a small, tarnished key. The key did not open anything in her possession on Iona. Its purpose and origin remain unknown. It is a small, physical artifact that seems to hint at a secret. A locked box, a hidden diary, or a London flat that might have held the answers to her strange life and even stranger death. The key, like the case itself, is a locked door that has never been opened. The death of Netta Fornario has become a classic case study in Fortean phenomena, a story where the lines between reality, belief, and madness are hopelessly blurred. It is a story that can be interpreted in multiple ways, each dependent on one's own worldview. For the skeptic, it is a tragic tale of mental illness. For the occultist, it is a documented case of a psychic battle. For the true crime enthusiast, it is a potential unsolved murder with a cleverly staged crime scene. The truth likely lies somewhere in the gray areas between these theories. Netta was clearly a woman in deep psychological distress, but that distress may well have been triggered or exacerbated by the real-world actions of a secretive and potentially dangerous magical society. She chose a place of immense power and isolation for her final stand, a place where legends of fairies and spirits are as real as the cold, hard stones. Whether she was battling the demons of her own mind or the ill intentions of others, the result was the same. She was found alone, clad in silk, on a desolate hill, a victim of a search for knowledge that had led her into a darkness from which she would never return. Her story serves as a haunting reminder that the pursuit of the unseen world can sometimes have very real and very fatal consequences. The strange and ritualistic death of Netta Fornario on the Isle of Iona sent a ripple of unease through both the small island community and the esoteric circles of London. The official explanation that she had died from exposure or heart failure brought on by a psychotic episode was a neat and tidy conclusion, but it failed to satisfy those who knew the details of her life and the bizarre circumstances of her death. For many, the case was not a simple tragedy of mental illness, but a dark testament to the very real dangers of the magical world she inhabited. The local constable and the coroner had a body with no discernible cause of death, a bizarrely arranged scene, and a victim whose own writings pointed not to a simple assailant, but to an enemy who could attack from across the sea using only the power of their mind. The investigation into her death focused heavily on her involvement with the Alpha Eta Omega, a successor organization to the original Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This was not a casual spiritual group. It was a highly structured, secretive magical society dedicated to the practice of ceremonial magic, astral travel, and the pursuit of hidden knowledge. The group was led by the formidable and charismatic Moina Mathers, widow of Samuel Liddell MacGregor Mathers, one of the Golden Dawn's original founders. Moina was considered by her followers to be a powerful sorceress in her own right, a direct link to the Order's authentic magical current. Netta Fornario had not just been a member. She had been a high-ranking initiate, a chief, privy to the Order's inner teachings and power structure. But recently, she had experienced a severe falling out with Moina Mathers and the Order's leadership. Netta's personal journals, recovered from her room at the cottage, became the key to understanding her state of mind. They were not the writings of a peaceful mystic, but of a woman in the grips of profound terror. Page after page was filled with paranoid, frantic entries about the psychic attacks she believed she was enduring. She wrote of being hounded by entities and subjected to telepathic hypnotism. She specifically named Moina Mathers as the source of these attacks, convinced that her former magical superior was punishing her for a perceived betrayal. Netta believed these were not just bad dreams or negative thoughts, but concentrated, magical assaults designed to break her mind and spirit. This led to the most sensational and enduring theory surrounding her death, that she was the victim of a genuine magical battle. Proponents of this theory, both then and now, argue that Netta was not suffering from paranoid delusions but was accurately describing a real psychic phenomenon. They believe that highly trained and powerful occult practitioners can, and do, project their consciousness and will across space to affect others, a practice sometimes referred to as a magical assault. In this narrative, Netta's flight to the Isle of Iona was a strategic retreat. She chose the island specifically for its ancient, sacred energies, believing it was a place of power that could act as a natural shield against the hostile forces being directed at her from London. From this perspective, the scene of her death was not one of madness, but of a desperate, final act of magical warfare. The location she chose, the fairy mound near a small loch, was no accident. In Celtic folklore, such places are considered gateways to the otherworld, liminal spaces where spiritual energies are at their most potent. The large cross she cut into the turf was not a random doodle. It was a powerful symbol of protection, a banishing ritual designed to create a consecrated space and ward off the evil she felt was closing in. The knife found beside her was not a murder weapon, but an athame, a ritual blade used in ceremonial magic to direct energy and draw magical circles. She was, in essence, creating a fortress of spirit and symbol. Her death, in this context, was the result of the duel. The psychic onslaught became so intense that her physical body could no longer withstand the terror, and her heart simply gave out. This theory might sound like pure fantasy to the modern, rational mind, but it was taken with utmost seriousness by many within the occult community of the 1920s and 30s. The most famous proponent of this view was Dion Fortune, a prominent occultist, psychologist, and author who had been a contemporary of Netta's. In her seminal book, Psychic Self-Defense, Fortune used Netta Fornario's case as a primary, real-world example of the lethal potential of magical attacks. Fortune was convinced that Netta had been astrally executed by the magical order she had defied. She argued that by undertaking a solitary magical retreat without the protection of her own magical group, Netta had left herself psychically exposed and vulnerable. Dion Fortune's analysis cemented the lead mask's case in occult lore, transforming it from a strange, unsolved death into the most famous documented case of a psychic murder in the 20th century. However, a more grounded and criminally plausible theory suggests that the psychic attacks were not supernatural at all, but were very human in origin. It's entirely possible that Netta was not being attacked by telepathy, but was being harassed, intimidated, and stalked by members of the Alpha Eta Omega who were unhappy with her defection. The messages she received could have been anonymous letters, coded threats, or unsettling phone calls designed to destabilize her. Her paranoia, in this case, would have been a perfectly rational response to a real-world campaign of psychological torment. This theory posits that someone from the Order may have followed her to the remote isolation of Iona. The goal might have been to retrieve sacred documents she may have taken, or simply to silence her and make an example of her to other potential defectors. The presence of the knife at the scene takes on a more sinister meaning in this scenario. It could have been used not as a ritual tool, but as a weapon of intimidation. This person could have confronted Netta at the cottage, threatening her and chasing her out into the freezing November night. The cuts on her bare feet would be the direct result of a frantic flight across the island's rough, heather-strewn terrain. The chase would have continued until she finally collapsed from a combination of terror, exhaustion, and the bitter cold. The killer, having caused her death without leaving a mark of conventional violence, could have then cleverly staged the scene. Knowing Netta's deep involvement in ceremonial magic, they could have arranged her body on the fairy mound, cut the cross into the turf, and placed the knife beside her, creating a tableau that pointed directly to a ritual gone wrong. It would be a diabolically clever way to commit a murder, using the victim's own life and beliefs as the ultimate misdirection, ensuring that the authorities would dismiss the death as a suicide or an accident brought on by her own eccentricities. This theory transforms the case from a supernatural mystery into a chillingly intelligent and unsolved homicide. Of course, the most rational and scientifically plausible explanation is that there was no external attacker at all, either human or psychic. Netta Fornario may have been suffering from a severe and deteriorating mental illness, such as schizophrenia or a schizoaffective disorder. Her deep immersion in the world of magic and esotericism would have provided the rich, symbolic language for her delusions. The psychic attacks and telepathic hypnotism were not external forces, but manifestations of her own internal turmoil. The figures and entities she feared were hallucinations, the products of a mind at war with itself. In this tragic interpretation, her final hours were a flight not from a human stalker or a magical assault, but from her own terrifying thoughts. In the grip of a complete psychotic break, she fled the perceived danger of the cottage and ran out into the only place she felt she could be safe, a place of power on the sacred island. The ritual she performed was real and meaningful to her, a desperate, final attempt to banish the demons of her own mind. The cuts on her feet were the price of her frantic, blind run through the darkness. Her death was a sad and lonely end, a case of a vulnerable woman, clad only in a thin silk robe, succumbing to the brutal reality of hypothermia on a cold Scottish night. This explanation is clean, logical, and aligns with a modern understanding of mental health. Yet, for some, it still feels incomplete. It doesn't fully account for the deliberate, almost artistic arrangement of the scene, or for that one final, nagging clue. After her death, when her personal belongings were being catalogued, a silver chain was found around her neck. On it hung a single, small, tarnished key. The key was not for her luggage, nor did it open any lock in the cottage where she was staying. Its purpose and origin remain a complete mystery. It is a tangible, physical artifact that seems to hint at a secret life, a locked box, a hidden diary, or a London apartment that might have contained the answers to her strange beliefs and her even stranger death. The key, like the case itself, is a locked door that has never been opened, a final, silent piece of a puzzle that is missing its most important pieces. The death of Netta Fornario remains a classic case of high strangeness, a story where the lines between reality, belief, and madness are so hopelessly blurred that a definitive conclusion is impossible. It is a perfect Rorschach test for one's own worldview. The skeptic sees a tragic case of mental illness. The occultist sees a documented psychic battle. The true crime enthusiast sees a cleverly concealed murder. The truth may be a complex combination of all three. Netta was a woman in deep psychological distress, a distress that was almost certainly amplified by her involvement in a secretive and psychologically intense magical order. She sought refuge in a place of ancient power, but that power was not enough to save her from the forces, internal or external, that pursued her to that lonely, windswept hill. The Great Brinks robbery, the strange death of Netta Fornario, is a mystery born from esoteric beliefs and a search for unseen worlds. But some of the most captivating crimes are not about the supernatural at all. They are grounded in the tangible world of cash, concrete, and meticulous real-world planning. This is a story about a crime of stunning precision and audacity, a heist so perfectly planned and executed that for years, it was known as the crime of the century. It's a story about a team of ordinary men who targeted an institution that was thought to be impenetrable, and who, for a brief, shining moment, pulled off the perfect score. This is the story of the Great Brinks robbery. Boston, Massachusetts, in the years following World War II, was a city of grit and neighborhood loyalties. In the close-knit, working-class communities of the North End and Charlestown, a certain kind of criminal underworld flourished. This was not the world of high-level mafia dons, but of small-time crooks, burglars, and safecrackers who honed their skills on local warehouses and businesses. It was in this environment that a man named Anthony Fats Pino began to dream of a score so big it would set them all up for life. Pino was a small-time hood, but he had big-time ambitions. His target was the Brinks Armored Car Depot in Boston's North End. The Brinks building was a fortress, the central nervous system for the movement of cash throughout New England. Millions of dollars passed through its vaults every week. To the average criminal, it was an untouchable prize. But to Pino and his crew, it was a challenge, a puzzle that they believed they could solve with enough patience and planning. The The planning for the Brinks job began nearly 2 years before the robbery itself, in 1948. It was a masterclass in low-tech surveillance and painstaking reconnaissance. The crew consisted of 11 men, a motley collection of burglars, bookies, and toughs, led by the charismatic Pino and his right-hand man, a shrewd operator named Joseph Big Joe McGinnis. They began by meticulously studying the Brinks building from the outside, watching the daily routines of the guards and the armored cars. They noted the times of deliveries, the shift changes, and the patterns of movement. But they knew that to truly understand the building, they had to get inside. Over the course of 18 months, members of the crew repeatedly and brazenly entered the Brinks depot after hours. They would pick the locks on the outer doors, sneak inside, and then carefully observe the layout. They would then just as carefully lock the doors behind them on their way out, leaving no trace of their presence. They did this dozens of times. They studied the alarm system, a complex web of magnetic contacts on the doors and windows. They painstakingly identified which of the 5 alarms were connected to the vaults and which were not. They even managed to steal the plans for the alarm system itself. Their most audacious move was to remove the cylinders from the locks on the 5 doors they would need to pass through on the night of the heist. They took them to a locksmith, had duplicate keys made, and then returned the original cylinders to the doors, all without arousing any suspicion. They were essentially building their own set of keys to the castle, right under the noses of the guards. They timed their practice runs with stopwatches, choreographing their movements down to the second. They knew exactly how long it would take to move from one point to another, how to avoid the guards' patrol routes, and how to operate in complete silence. They also developed a unique look for the heist itself. To ensure they couldn't be easily identified, they all wore navy blue pea coats, chauffeurs' caps, and rubber Halloween masks. They also wore crepe-soled shoes to muffle their footsteps. They would be a team of silent, masked phantoms. After nearly 2 years of obsessive planning, they were ready. They chose the evening of January 17, 1950. They knew that the cash from the day's collections would be in the vault, but that the larger weekend deposits had not yet been sorted and moved, meaning the security would be slightly less intense than at the end of a week. The timing was perfect. That evening, the 11 men gathered. 7 of them would go inside, while the others would act as lookouts and getaway drivers. At around 6:55 p.m., the team approached the Brinks building. They used their custom-made keys to silently unlock the series of outer doors. They moved through the building with the quiet confidence of men who had walked the same route dozens of times before. They knew exactly where to go. Inside, they surprised the 5 Brinks employees who were on duty, counting and sorting the day's money. The employees were terrified to see a group of masked figures emerge from the shadows, each holding a handgun. The thieves were professional and disciplined. There was no shouting, no unnecessary violence. They ordered the employees to lie face down on the floor, bound their hands behind their backs with rope, and placed tape over their mouths. They were so efficient that one employee later said he thought he was being tied up by a doctor because of the precision of the knots. With the employees neutralized, the crew went to work on the vaults. They knew which doors were wired and which were not. They calmly opened the large steel cage where the cash was stored. Inside were bags and boxes filled with money, cash, checks, and money orders. They ignored the checks and money orders, which would be too difficult to trace and fence. They focused only on the untraceable cash. They filled 12 large canvas sacks with money. The total haul was staggering. They had stolen over $1.2 million in cash and another $1.5 million in other securities. In today's money, the total value of the heist was nearly $30 million. It was the largest single cash robbery in United States history at the time. The entire operation inside the building took less than 30 minutes. The crew moved the heavy bags of cash back out the way they had come, locking the doors behind them. They loaded the money into their getaway truck and drove away, melting back into the Boston night. They had done it. They had breached the impenetrable fortress and had pulled off the perfect crime. They had left behind no fingerprints, no clues, and no witnesses who could identify them. All that was left behind were 5 bound and terrified employees and an empty vault. The crime of the century was complete, and the biggest challenge for the gang was just beginning. How to get away with it? The immediate aftermath of the Great Brinks robbery was a scene of utter bewilderment for law enforcement. The thieves had vanished as if into thin air, leaving behind a crime scene that was remarkable for its lack of clues. The 5 bound employees could offer little help. They had only seen a group of silent, masked figures. The press dubbed the perpetrators the specter-goggled gang and hailed the heist as a work of criminal genius. The FBI and local police were faced with immense pressure to solve what was being called the crime of the century, but they had almost nothing to go on. The investigation began with a massive citywide hunt for any shred of evidence. Hundreds of known criminals and mob associates were questioned, but the Boston underworld, adhering to its strict code of silence, offered nothing. The FBI's best hope was to trace the stolen money. They had a list of the serial numbers for some of the larger bills, and they alerted banks and financial institutions across the country. But the thieves were smarter than that. They knew the money was hot. The 11 members of the crew had made a pact. They agreed to hide the money and not spend a single dollar of it for at least 6 years, until the statute of limitations for the robbery had expired. They believed that if they could just lay low and wait it out, they would be home free. The money was divided up and each man went his own way, hiding his share and returning to his normal working-class life. They were sitting on fortunes, but they had to live like paupers. The mastermind, Anthony Fats Pino, even had to borrow money from a loan shark just a few weeks after the robbery to pay his taxes. This pact of silence and patience was the key to their success, but it was also the seed of their eventual downfall. For the next several years, the investigation went completely cold. The FBI pursued thousands of false leads, including a bizarre theory that the heist had been funded by Soviet intelligence. The case became a source of major frustration and embarrassment for law enforcement. The perfect crime seemed to be holding, but the pressure of sitting on a fortune they couldn't spend, combined with the constant fear of being caught, began to wear on the members of the gang. The camaraderie that had been forged during the 2 years of planning began to fracture under the weight of greed, paranoia, and internal squabbles. The first major crack appeared over the division of the loot. Joseph Big Joe McGinnis, one of the leaders, had been entrusted with holding a large portion of the cash for several other members. When they came to collect their share, they found that McGinnis had shorted them, keeping a larger cut for himself. This act of greed created deep resentment and mistrust within the group. The pressure intensified as several members of the gang were arrested and convicted for other, unrelated crimes. From their prison cells, they grew increasingly paranoid that the members on the outside were spending their share of the money. The pact was beginning to crumble. The key figure in the case's unraveling was a man named Joseph Specs O'Keefe. O'Keefe was a tough, career criminal who had been one of the primary gunmen inside the Brinks depot. In the years following the heist, he had been involved in a series of other crimes and was constantly being hounded by the police. He was also furious with Pino and McGinnis, believing they had cheated him out of his rightful share of the loot. He began to make noise, threatening to talk if he didn't get more money. To silence him, the leaders of the gang decided to hire a hitman to kill him. In 1954, a hitman named Elmer Trigger Burke ambushed O'Keefe in a parking garage. A shootout ensued, and O'Keefe was shot and seriously wounded, but he survived. The attempt on his life was the final straw. He had adhered to the code of silence, and in return, his own partners had tried to kill him. His loyalty was shattered. While recovering from his injuries, O'Keefe was arrested and convicted on other charges and was facing a long prison sentence. He knew he had nothing left to lose. He decided to do the one thing the gang never thought he would do. He decided to talk. In January 1956, just days before the 6-year statute of limitations was set to expire on the Brinks robbery, Specs O'Keefe sat down with the FBI and confessed everything. He laid out the entire plot in stunning detail, from the 2 years of painstaking reconnaissance to the execution of the heist itself. He named every single one of the 11 men involved. It was the breakthrough the FBI had been waiting for 6 years. Armed with O'Keefe's confession, the authorities moved swiftly. They rounded up the remaining members of the gang. 8 of the 11 men, including Anthony Pino and Big Joe McGinnis, were arrested, tried, and convicted based largely on O'Keefe's testimony. They received life sentences. 2 other members of the gang had died in the intervening years. Specs O'Keefe, for his cooperation, received a reduced sentence and was released after just 4 years. The crime of the century had finally been solved. But there was one final, enduring mystery. The money. Of the nearly $3 million that was stolen, only about $58,000 was ever recovered. The rest of the cash simply vanished. The gang members refused to talk, taking the secrets of their hidden fortunes with them to their graves. It is believed that the money was hidden so well, perhaps buried in various locations or walled up in houses, that it was either lost, destroyed by the elements, or is still out there, waiting to be found. The Great Brinks robbery is a classic story of a perfect plan undone by the simple, timeless forces of human greed and betrayal. The 11 men who pulled it off were not criminal masterminds in the traditional sense. They were patient, disciplined, and meticulous planners who relied on low-tech ingenuity rather than high-tech gadgets. Their downfall was not a brilliant piece of detective work, but the inevitable implosion of their own conspiracy. The pact of silence, which was their greatest strength, became their greatest weakness when one of them was pushed too far. The story became a legendary case study for the FBI, a testament to the fact that even the most perfectly planned crime can be solved if you can just find the one loose thread that will unravel the entire tapestry. The specter-goggled gang had their moment of glory, but in the end, the crime of the century bought them little more than prison sentences and a permanent place in the annals of American criminal history. The murders of the Bricca family, the disappearance of Ray Gricker, is a story about a void. A man of public standing who stepped out of his life and left behind only questions. But some crimes are not about absence. They are about a brutal, terrifying presence. This is a story that takes place not in a remote wilderness or a dark alley, but within the supposed sanctuary of a suburban home. It's a story about a family that was systematically and silently executed. A crime so vicious and so bafflingly motiveless that it shattered a community's sense of security and has remained a cold, dark enigma for over half a century. This is the story of the Bricca family murders. Cincinnati, Ohio, in the late 1960s, was a city of quiet, middle-class neighborhoods and traditional family values. The suburb of Green Hills was a perfect example of this. It was one of the nation's first planned Greenbelt communities, designed to be a peaceful, idyllic place to raise a family, with winding streets, parks, and a strong sense of community. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other, and violent crime felt like something that only happened in other, bigger cities. On a quiet street in this idyllic suburb lived the Bricca family. Jerry Bricca was a 28-year-old chemical engineer at Monsanto, a successful and well-liked young professional. His wife, 26-year-old Linda, was a former flight attendant, described by friends as vibrant, intelligent, and a devoted mother. Their only child was their 4-year-old daughter, Debbie. She was a bright and happy little girl. They were the picture of the perfect young American family, living a comfortable, happy life in their modest, well-kept home at 6452 Clearfield Court. The story of their tragic end begins on the evening of Monday, September 25, 1966. That night, Linda Bricca spoke on the phone with her mother. It was a normal, cheerful conversation. Linda mentioned that Jerry was not feeling well and had decided to go to bed early. This was the last time anyone is known to have spoken to any member of the Bricca family. In the days that followed, a strange silence descended upon the house on Clearfield Court. Neighbors noticed that the newspapers were piling up on the front porch. The mail began to overflow from the mailbox. The family car, a Chevrolet station wagon, remained parked in the driveway, unmoved. This was unusual for the Briccas, who were known for their neatness and their predictable routines. A neighbor who worked with Jerry at Monsanto noted that he hadn't shown up for work all week, which was completely out of character for the reliable engineer. The neighbors began to grow concerned. They talked amongst themselves, wondering if the family had gone on an impromptu trip. On the evening of Tuesday, September 27th, a neighbor named Richard Meyer decided to investigate. He walked over to the Bricca house. He noticed that the windows were all closed and the curtains were drawn, but he could hear the faint sound of a television playing inside. He also noticed a strange, sweet, cloying odor emanating from the house. He knocked on the doors but got no answer. Feeling that something was deeply wrong, he decided to call the police to request a welfare check. The police, however, were slow to respond. They initially dismissed the concerns, suggesting the family was likely just out of town. It wasn't until the following evening, Wednesday, September 28th, after more calls from concerned neighbors, that an officer was finally dispatched to the scene. The officer arrived and found the house sealed tight. He too smelled the strange, sickeningly sweet odor. He tried the doors and found the front door unlocked. With a growing sense of dread, he pushed it open and entered the home. The scene that greeted him was one of domestic stillness turned macabre. The television was indeed on, its blue light casting flickering shadows in the otherwise dark living room. The house was neat and tidy, but the smell was overwhelming. The officer followed the scent up the stairs to the master bedroom. There, he made a horrific discovery. Lying in the bed was the body of Jerry Bricka. He was on his back, and he had been stabbed multiple times in the chest and back. The officer moved to the second bedroom, which served as little Debbie's room. The horror intensified. Lying on the floor next to her bed was the body of Linda Bricka. She had also been brutally stabbed. And in her own small bed, tucked under the covers as if she were sleeping, was 4-year-old Debbie. She, too, had been murdered, stabbed to death in the most vulnerable and innocent of places. The crime scene was a chilling tableau of contradictions. It was a scene of extreme personal violence. The use of a knife suggests a frenzied, close-quarters attack. And yet, the house itself was eerily undisturbed. There were no signs of a forced entry. There were no signs of a robbery. Valuables, including cash and Linda's jewelry, were in plain sight. There were no signs of a struggle. It was as if the Bricka family had been killed in their sleep by a ghost, a silent intruder who had moved through their home with a specific, murderous purpose and then vanished without a trace. The Hamilton County coroner determined that the family had been killed sometime on the night of Monday, September 25th, or in the early morning hours of Tuesday, the 26th. The weapon was believed to be a thin-bladed knife, possibly a paring knife or a stiletto, but the murder weapon itself was missing. The victims had been bound with adhesive tape before being killed, though the bindings had been removed from Jerry and Linda. Debbie's hands were still bound behind her back. The use of bindings suggested a killer who was in control, a killer who had taken the time to subdue their victims before murdering them. But how could one person subdue an entire family without a struggle? It suggested the killer was someone the family knew and trusted, someone they might have let into their home willingly in the middle of the night. The idyllic community of Green Hills was shattered. The idea that a young, well-liked family could be so brutally and systematically executed in their own home, in a neighborhood where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked, was incomprehensible. A wave of fear swept through the Cincinnati suburbs. People began locking their doors for the first time in their lives. The Bricka murders became the crime that ended the innocence of a community. The investigation was massive and intense. Detectives were faced with a crime that seemed to have no motive. This was not a robbery. It was not a sexual assault. It appeared to be a crime of pure, unadulterated rage. But who would have harbored such a rage against the Brickas? They were, by all accounts, a friendly, unassuming family with no known enemies. Investigators began the painstaking process of digging into Jerry and Linda's lives, searching for any hidden conflict, any secret that could explain why they were targeted. They looked at Jerry's work at Monsanto. Was he involved in a sensitive project? Had he had a dispute with a coworker? They interviewed his colleagues, but found nothing. He was well respected and had no issues at work. They turned to Linda's life. She was a devoted mother, but she also had a wide circle of friends and a more outgoing personality than her husband. They began to explore her past, her relationships before she was married, searching for a jilted lover or a dark secret. But again, they found nothing that pointed to a motive for such a brutal crime. The Bricka family seemed to be exactly what they appeared to be, a normal, happy family. With no clear motive, the investigation stalled. The killer had been a ghost. They had left no fingerprints, no weapon, and no obvious clues. The case was a vacuum of hard evidence. The only thing the police had was the nature of the crime itself. The use of bindings, the lack of a struggle, and the personal, up-close violence of a knife. It all pointed to a killer who was not a stranger, a killer who had been willingly let into the house. But the identity of this trusted visitor, and the reason for their murderous rage, remained a complete and terrifying mystery. A mystery that would haunt the city of Cincinnati for decades to come. The investigation into the brutal slaying of the Bricca family became a frustrating and obsessive hunt for a phantom. With no forensic evidence and no apparent motive, the Hamilton County Sheriff's investigators were forced to rely on old-fashioned detective work, chasing down rumors and meticulously dissecting the lives of Jerry and Linda Bricca, hoping to find a crack in their seemingly perfect facade. The prevailing theory remained that the killer was someone known to the family. The lack of a forced entry, combined with the fact that the family dog had not been heard barking, strongly suggested that Jerry or Linda had willingly opened their door to their murderer late on that Monday night. The focus of the investigation soon began to coalesce around Linda Bricca's social circle. While Jerry was quiet and reserved, Linda was outgoing and vivacious. She had many friends and was active in the community. Investigators started to hear whispers and rumors about her life, stories that hinted at a world beyond the simple image of a suburban housewife. Several friends confidentially told police that Linda had been unhappy in her marriage and may have been involved in at least one extramarital affair. This was a major potential breakthrough. A crime of such personal, frenzied violence often points to a motive of jealousy or romantic rage. Investigators began to look closely at the men in Linda's life. One name that came up repeatedly was a local man who was known to have been infatuated with her. He was questioned extensively, but he had a solid alibi for the night of the murders and no evidence could be found to link him to the crime. Still, the possibility that the murders were the result of a love triangle gone horribly wrong remained a strong and compelling theory. The investigation took another turn when detectives began to look into the Bricca's social activities. They learned that the couple, particularly Linda, enjoyed attending parties and that they occasionally smoked marijuana, a fact that was somewhat unusual for a buttoned-down suburban couple in 1966. This led investigators down a path into the local drug subculture. Could the Briccas have been involved in something more serious than casual use? Was it possible that Jerry, the chemical engineer, was using his skills for something other than his work at Monsanto? Could a drug deal gone wrong have been the motive for the killings? This theory would explain the extreme violence, but it didn't seem to fit with the couple's overall lifestyle. There was no evidence of large amounts of cash in the house or any other sign of drug trafficking. Like so many other leads, it remained a speculative dead end. As the years passed, the case grew colder, but it never left the public consciousness in Cincinnati. It became the city's most infamous unsolved crime, a chilling suburban ghost story. The house on Clearfield Court stood empty for a time, a grim reminder of the tragedy, before it was eventually sold and occupied by new families who had to live with its dark history. Decades went by with no new leads. Then, in the 2010s, a renewed interest in the case, fueled by online forums and a new generation of investigators, brought a new name to the forefront, a name that had been there from the very beginning but had never been fully explored. Dick Witt. Richard Dick Witt was a neighbor. He lived just a few houses down from the Briccas on Clearfield Court. He was a charismatic and well-liked veterinarian, a pillar of the Green Hills community. He was also a close friend of the Bricca family. He and Jerry often went bowling together, and their wives were friendly. Witt was one of the concerned neighbors who had first noticed something was wrong at the Bricca house. He was there when the police finally entered the home and discovered the bodies. He was, by all accounts, a devastated and helpful friend in the immediate aftermath of the crime. However, years later, investigators began to look at Dick Witt in a new light. They discovered that he had a dark side that he had kept well hidden. He had a history of rage and a volatile temper. He was also, it was later revealed, a serial philanderer who had engaged in numerous extramarital affairs. Most chillingly, a woman came forward to claim that she had been having an affair with Witt in 1966, and that on the night of the Bricca murders, he had shown up at her apartment late at night, his clothes stained and his demeanor frantic. He had allegedly confessed to her that he had done something terrible. This new information caused investigators to re-examine Witt's role in the original investigation. He had been questioned in 1966, but as a friendly, helpful neighbor, not as a primary suspect. Now, his actions seemed more suspicious. His immediate presence at the crime scene, his eagerness to help the police. Was this the action of a concerned friend, or a killer trying to control the investigation and see what the police knew? The motive in this new theory was connected to Linda Bricca. It is believed that Dick Witt was also having an affair with Linda. On the night of the murders, something went wrong. Perhaps Linda had threatened to expose the affair to Witt's wife, or to her own husband, Jerry. This threat could have sent the volatile Witt into a murderous rage. He went to the Bricca home, was let in by Linda, and the confrontation escalated. He killed Linda, and then, to eliminate all witnesses, he systematically murdered Jerry and little Debbie as well. The use of a thin-bladed knife, like a scalpel, would be consistent with the tools a veterinarian would have easy access to. This theory seemed to fit all the known facts of the case. The killer was known to the family, the motive was personal and rage-fueled, and the weapon was something the suspect would possess. But it was still circumstantial. The key witness, the woman Witt allegedly confessed to, was never able to provide testimony that could be used in court. Dick Witt continued to live his life as a respected veterinarian in the Cincinnati area. He was never charged with the Bricca murders. He died in Florida in 2018. After his death, a local true crime author and a retired police detective tried to get a posthumous DNA sample from his estate to compare against any potential trace evidence from the crime scene. But their request was denied. The case of the Bricca family murders remains officially unsolved. It is a story that serves as a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often not strangers, but the people we trust the most, the friendly neighbors who live just a few doors down. The crime shattered the illusion of suburban safety, proving that unimaginable violence can erupt in the quietest of neighborhoods, behind the most unassuming of doors. The image of the Bricca house, the newspapers piling up on the porch, the television casting a lonely blue light into an empty living room, is a haunting symbol of a life interrupted. The 3 members of the Bricca family were killed in the place they felt most secure, likely by a person they knew and trusted. The killer then walked away, melting back into the fabric of the community, and kept their dark secret for a lifetime. The silence from the house on Clearfield Court was eventually broken by the police, but the silence of the killer has remained absolute, a final, chilling victory in a crime that has left a permanent scar on the heart of a city. The Gardner Museum Heist, the brutal, unsolved case of the Bricca family, is a story about the violation of the ultimate sanctuary, the home. But some crimes violate a different kind of sanctuary, a public space where our collective history and culture are meant to be preserved for all time. This is a story about a crime of stunning precision and audacity, a heist so perfectly planned and executed that for years, it was known as the crime of the century. It's a story about a team of thieves who targeted an institution that was thought to be impenetrable, and who, for a brief, shining moment, pulled off the perfect score, leaving behind a mystery that has baffled the world for over 3 decades. This is the story of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum heist. Boston, Massachusetts, in the late 20th century, is a city proud of its rich history and its world-class cultural institutions. Among the most unique and cherished of these is the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. It is not a typical museum with sterile white walls and objects arranged in chronological order. It is a work of art in itself, a Venetian-style palace built at the turn of the 20th century by the eccentric and brilliant art collector Isabella Stewart Gardner. She designed it to be an immersive, intimate experience, arranging her vast collection of masterpieces not by period or artist, but according to her own aesthetic vision. The museum is a time capsule, a reflection of one woman's passion. Her will stipulated that the collection must remain exactly as she left it. Nothing could be moved, sold, or added. To walk through its halls is to walk through her mind. The night of March 17, 1990, was St. Patrick's Day, and the city of Boston was alive with celebration. As the revelry wound down in the early morning hours of March 18th, 2 security guards were on duty at the Gardner Museum. They were Rick Abath, 23, and Randy Heston, 25. The museum had a reputation for being somewhat lax on security. It was more of a grand old house than a modern fortress, and the guards were young and relatively inexperienced. At 1:24 a.m., a red buzzer sounded at the security desk. Two men, dressed as police officers, were at the side entrance on Palace Road. They spoke to Rick Abath through the intercom, stating that they were responding to a report of a disturbance in the courtyard. Abath, looking at the security cameras, could see the two men in what appeared to be authentic Boston police uniforms. Believing them to be legitimate officers, and in a critical breach of museum protocol, he buzzed them in. The two men entered the museum. They approached the security desk and told Abath that he looked familiar, that they might have a warrant out for his arrest, and that he needed to step away from the desk. Abath, intimidated and convinced he was dealing with real police, complied. He was ordered to summon the other guard, Randy Heston, to the desk. When Heston arrived, the two officers quickly revealed their true intentions. In a swift, professional move, they subdued both guards, forcing them to the ground and handcuffing them. They told Abath, "You're not being arrested. This is a robbery." To ensure their compliance, they wrapped duct tape around the guards' heads and eyes. The thieves then took the two guards down to the museum's basement. They led them to separate, remote areas, chaining them to a steam pipe and a workbench. The guards were now neutralized, helpless and blindfolded in the dark, cavernous basement of the museum. The thieves had done it. They had bypassed the security system with a simple, audacious trick. They now had complete and total control of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. The greatest art heist in modern history was underway. For the next 81 minutes, these two men had free reign of a palace filled with some of the most priceless treasures in the world. But their actions from this point on are what make the crime so deeply perplexing. They were not brutish smash and grab robbers. They moved with a strange combination of confidence and curious imprecision. They did not ransack the museum. Instead, they seemed to have a very specific yet bizarre shopping list. Their primary target was the Dutch Room, a gallery containing some of the museum's most valuable works. Here, they committed their most infamous act of vandalism. They went to Rembrandt's only known seascape, the magnificent The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was a large painting, framed and protected by glass. The thieves crudely cut the canvas directly from its frame, a brutal act that would make any art historian cringe. They did the same to another Rembrandt masterpiece, A Lady and Gentleman in Black. They also stole a small, postage stamp-sized self-portrait etching by Rembrandt. Their most valuable prize was in this room, Johannes Vermeer's The Concert. It is one of only 34 known paintings by the Dutch master, making it virtually priceless and one of the most valuable stolen objects in the world. They simply took it off the wall. They also stole a work by Govert Flink, who was a pupil of Rembrandt. Curiously, they first attempted to remove a large Rembrandt self-portrait from the wall, but apparently found it too large or too difficult to handle and abandoned the effort. Their movements through the other galleries were equally strange. They went to the short gallery and stole 5 Degas sketches of racehorses and jockeys. They also took a bronze eagle finial that had sat atop a Napoleonic flag. The flag itself, a far more valuable and historic object, was left behind. In another gallery, they took a small, relatively insignificant ancient Chinese bronze beaker, or gu. The list of what they took is almost as baffling as what they left behind. The museum's most valuable single painting, Titian's The Rape of Europa, was in a nearby room, yet it was left untouched. They ignored works by Raphael, Botticelli, and Michelangelo, masterpieces that would be the centerpiece of any other heist. Their choices seemed almost random, a mix of world-renowned masterpieces and seemingly minor decorative objects. It was a haul that was both priceless and strangely idiosyncratic. At 2:45 a.m., after 81 minutes inside the museum, the two men made their final move. They returned to the security desk, took the videotapes from the security recorders that had captured their entry, and vanished back into the Boston night. They left no fingerprints, no stray hairs, no forensic evidence of any kind. They had come as ghosts dressed as cops and had disappeared with 13 objects valued at over $500 million. The next morning, the arriving day shift guards found the museum quiet and the front desk empty. When they discovered the bound and gagged night guards in the basement, they knew something terrible had happened. They called the police. When the detectives and museum officials walked into the galleries, they were met with a scene of cultural devastation. The empty frames hanging crookedly on the walls of the Dutch room became a symbol of the profound and violent loss. They were not just empty spaces. They were wounds, a permanent record of the masterpieces that had been ripped from their home. The greatest art heist in history had been executed with stunning success, and the largest and most complex art recovery investigation in the world was just beginning. The discovery of the empty frames at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum on the morning of March 18, 1990, sent a shockwave through the art world and the city of Boston. The scale of the loss was staggering. 13 works of art, collectively valued at over $500 million, had vanished. The stolen pieces included 3 Rembrandts, a Vermeer, one of the rarest and most sought-after artists in the world, a Manet, and 5 Degas sketches. The crime was not just a theft, it was a cultural evisceration. An FBI investigation was launched immediately, beginning a frustrating, decades-long hunt for the stolen masterpieces and the audacious thieves who had taken them. The investigation began with the 2 security guards, Rick Abath and Randy Heston. They were the only witnesses, and their actions were immediately placed under intense scrutiny. The decision by Abath to buzz in the 2 men, a clear violation of museum protocol, made him a primary person of interest. Why had he broken the rules so easily? Investigators explored the possibility that it was an inside job, that Abath was either a willing participant in the heist or had been coerced into helping the thieves. Abath's story was that he was a young, inexperienced guard who had been duped by the convincing police uniforms and the authoritative demeanor of the 2 men. He maintained that he genuinely believed they were police officers. However, details of his personal life raised suspicion. He had a reputation as a bit of a slacker, known for sometimes showing up to work under the influence. On the night of the heist, he had reportedly hosted a party at the museum just hours before the thieves arrived. Another major security breach. Polygraph tests administered to Abath were inconclusive. While the FBI has never officially cleared him, they have also never found any concrete evidence to charge him with the crime. He remains a figure of intense speculation, a man whose fateful decision, whether born of naivete or complicity, enabled the greatest art theft in history. With the inside job theory leading nowhere, the FBI turned its focus to the Boston criminal underworld. A crime of this scale and sophistication seemed to point directly to organized crime. The Boston area in the 1990s was home to several powerful mob factions, both Italian-American mafia families and Irish gangs. These groups had the resources, the connections, and the audacity to pull off such a heist. The leading theory for years was that the heist was orchestrated by the local mafia, specifically a crew run by a notorious capo regime named Carmelo Merlino. The motive, investigators believed, was not to sell the art on the open market. Masterpieces of this fame are essentially unsellable, but to use them as a bargaining chip. The idea was that the mob could hold the priceless artworks as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card, something to be traded back to the authorities in exchange for leniency for one of their high-ranking members who might be facing a long prison sentence. This theory was bolstered by tips from various informants within the criminal underworld. The FBI began to focus on a low-level mob associate named David Turner, who was part of Merlino's crew. Turner fit the physical description of one of the thieves and had a reputation for being a skilled art thief. In the late 1990s, the FBI, in a complex sting operation, attempted to get Merlino and his crew to lead them to the stolen art. They arrested them on unrelated robbery charges, hoping that the pressure of a long prison sentence would force them to use the Gardner paintings as their bargaining chip. Merlino reportedly bragged to an informant that he knew where the art was and could get it back for the right price. However, just as a deal seemed to be taking shape, Merlino died in prison. The trail to the art, if he ever truly had it, died with him. Another prominent suspect was a notorious Boston art thief and antiques dealer named Miles J. Connor Jr. Connor was a brilliant but flamboyant criminal who had a long history of stealing valuable objects and then using them to negotiate lighter sentences for his various crimes. At the time of the Gardner heist, Connor was in federal prison. However, he has long claimed that he was the mastermind behind the robbery, that he had cased the museum years earlier and had passed on the plans to his associates to execute while he was incarcerated. He claimed his motive was exactly as the FBI had suspected, to get the art and use it to bargain for his own release. He even told investigators that he could lead them to the paintings. However, his stories have been inconsistent, and many in law enforcement believe he is simply a narcissist trying to attach his name to the most famous art crime in history. He has never been able to produce the art, and his claims remain unverified. The investigation took a major turn in 2013, when the FBI made a stunning public announcement. For the first time, they stated with a high degree of confidence that they had identified the two thieves. They did not release their names, as both men were deceased, but sources later identified them as two low-level mob associates from Dorchester, a neighborhood in Boston, George Reisfelder and Leonard DiMuzio. The FBI claimed that the art had been transported to Connecticut and Philadelphia in the years following the heist, and was offered for sale by a group of aging mobsters. They made a public appeal, stating that they knew who had the art and that it was time to return it. They offered a $5 million reward for information leading to the recovery of the art. No questions asked. The reward has since been increased to $10 million. Despite this confident announcement, the paintings have not surfaced. The announcement seemed to be a high-stakes gamble by the FBI, an attempt to flush out the artworks by signaling to the current holders that the investigation was closing in. But the gamble did not pay off. The art remains hidden. The mystery of what happened to the 13 masterpieces is as compelling as the mystery of who took them. It is highly unlikely they were sold. The Vermeer and the Rembrandts are too famous. They would be instantly recognized. The most probable theory is that they are being held in a private collection, possessed by a reclusive, amoral collector who commissioned the theft for the sole purpose of private ownership, a real-life Dr. No figure. Another possibility is that the art was hidden away so well by the original thieves that its location was lost when they died. In this tragic scenario, the priceless canvases could be slowly decaying in a damp basement or a storage locker somewhere, their owners unaware of the cultural treasure they possess. The worst-case scenario is that the art, being too hot to handle, was simply destroyed to eliminate the evidence. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum has never given up hope. In accordance with Isabella's will, the empty frames from which the masterpieces were cut still hang on the gallery walls. They are not just placeholders. They are a profound statement of loss and a promise of return. They are ghostly voids that serve as a constant, poignant reminder of what was taken. They represent the museum's unwavering belief that one day, the paintings will be brought home and restored to their rightful place. The Gardner heist is more than just a story of a brilliant crime. It is a story about the fragility of our cultural heritage and the arrogance of those who would claim it for themselves. The thieves did not just steal paint and canvas. They stole a piece of our shared history. The empty frames are a testament to their crime, a permanent scar on the face of the art world. For over 30 years, the world's most valuable missing objects have remained at large, their whereabouts a secret held by a handful of aging criminals, or perhaps lost to time itself. The $10 million reward remains unclaimed, waiting for the one person who can finally lead the world back to its lost masterpieces and close the book on the most audacious art heist in history. The People's Temple. The road to Jonestown. The story of Jonestown does not begin in the dense, humid jungles of South America. It begins in the dusty, rural flatlands of Indiana during the Great Depression. It begins with a boy named James Warren Jones. Born in 1931, Jim Jones was a strange and solitary child, marked by an early and intense obsession with religion and death. While other children played games, young Jones would reportedly conduct elaborate funerals for small animals. He was a voracious reader, studying the lives of figures like Stalin, Marx, and Gandhi, but he was most captivated by the power and charisma of Pentecostal preachers. He would practice his own sermons in his family's barn, preaching to the other children in the neighborhood, honing the hypnotic, persuasive speaking style that would one day draw thousands to his cause. In the 1950s, Jones founded his first church in Indianapolis. It was not, in its early days, the cult that history would remember. It was a progressive, radical, and, for its time and place, a deeply admirable institution. He called it the Wings of Deliverance and later the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. Its most revolutionary feature was its policy of full racial integration. In the deeply segregated Indiana of the 1950s, this was a shocking and courageous act. Jones actively welcomed African American families into his congregation, creating what he called a rainbow family. He preached a message of social justice, equality, and communal living that was incredibly appealing to those who had been marginalized and oppressed by mainstream society. The early People's Temple was more than just a church. It was a social services powerhouse. Jones and his wife, Marceline, opened soup kitchens and nursing homes. They provided food, clothing, and housing for the poor. They became a true family for people who had been abandoned by everyone else. For hundreds of followers, Jim Jones was not a manipulative charlatan. He was a savior, a man who practiced the Christian gospel of charity and equality that other churches only preached about. He was charismatic, intelligent, and seemed to possess a genuine empathy for the downtrodden. It was this foundation of good works and authentic community that gave him his power. But alongside this benevolent public face, a darker, more controlling element was beginning to emerge. Jones began to claim he had divine powers. He would perform elaborate faith healings during his sermons, allegedly curing people of cancer and other terminal illnesses. These healings were later revealed to be carefully staged deceptions, using planted Confederates and tricks like pulling chicken gizzards from a person's throat and claiming they were cancerous tumors. He demanded absolute loyalty, slowly replacing the Bible's teachings with his own. He began referring to himself as Father and cultivated an atmosphere of complete dependency. In the mid-1960s, driven by a paranoid fear of nuclear annihilation and a desire to find a more progressive environment, Jones moved his entire congregation across the country to Redwood Valley in Northern California. It was here that the People's Temple truly began to grow in power and influence. They later expanded into the major urban centers of San Francisco and Los Angeles. In the politically charged atmosphere of the 1970s, the temple became a formidable political machine. They could provide thousands of disciplined, enthusiastic volunteers and, more importantly, a reliable block of votes. Politicians, including some of the most powerful figures in California, courted Jim Jones. He helped elect San Francisco Mayor George Moscone and was rewarded with a powerful position as the chairman of the San Francisco Housing Authority. He was seen as a powerful civic leader, a man who could get things done. But inside the temple, the reality was becoming increasingly grim. The utopian promise of a rainbow family was curdling into a totalitarian regime. Members were required to turn over all their property and possessions to the church. They lived communally, their lives completely controlled by Jones and his inner circle, the Planning Commission. Communication with the outside world, including with family members who were not part of the temple, was severely restricted. Discipline was brutal. Members who broke the rules were subjected to public humiliation, severe beatings, and psychological torture in front of the entire congregation. Jones cultivated a powerful us versus them mentality, convincing his followers that the outside world was racist, corrupt, and determined to destroy their perfect socialist community. He was their only protector, their only source of truth. By the mid-1970s, the cracks in the temple's facade were beginning to show. Defectors began to emerge, telling horrifying stories of abuse, financial exploitation, and Jones's erratic, drug-fueled behavior. An organization called the Concerned Relatives was formed by family members desperate to get their loved ones out of the temple's grasp. The press began to investigate the allegations. Jones felt the walls closing in. The utopia he had built in California was no longer safe from the prying eyes of the outside world. He needed a final escape, a place so remote and so isolated that no one could interfere with his absolute control. He resurrected an old idea, a plan to create a true, apostolic socialist paradise on Earth. He had secured a large tract of remote jungle land in the small, impoverished South American nation of Guyana. It was the perfect location. Isolated, far from American jurisdiction, and with a cooperative government that was happy to accept the influx of people and resources. He called it the People's Temple Agricultural Project. But it would become known to the world by a simpler, more infamous name, Jonestown. He began sending his most loyal followers ahead to clear the jungle and build the settlement. He sold the vision to his congregation as the ultimate promised land, a sanctuary free from the racism, sexism, and capitalism of the United States. It would be a tropical paradise where they could build a perfect society from the ground up. For his followers, who had already given him everything, this was the final, logical step in their journey of faith. They began to emigrate by the hundreds, leaving behind their homes, their families, and their country, filled with the hope of building a new world in the jungle. They had no idea that they were not emigrating to a paradise, but were being led, step by hopeful step, into a trap from which there would be no escape. The migration to Jonestown began in earnest in 1977. It was an exodus born of both hope and fear. For the hundreds of devoted followers of the People's Temple, the journey to the remote jungle of Guyana represented the culmination of their spiritual and political aspirations. It was the chance to build the Rainbow Family in its purest form, a socialist utopia far from the perceived evils of a racist and capitalist America. But for Jim Jones, the move was an act of strategic desperation. A damning exposé detailing the abuses within the temple was about to be published in New West magazine. Jones knew the article would shatter his public image as a benevolent civic leader and bring a new level of scrutiny from the authorities. He had to get his followers out of the country before the story broke. The exodus was chaotic and hurried. Hundreds of temple members were rushed onto planes, often with little notice, leaving behind possessions, homes, and family members who were not part of the group. They arrived in a place that was a world away from the comfortable life they had known in California. Jonestown was not the tropical paradise Jones had promised in his sermons. It was a raw, primitive, and punishingly remote settlement carved out of dense, unforgiving jungle. The heat was oppressive, the humidity was suffocating, and the labor was back-breaking. The followers, a mix of dedicated idealists, elderly retirees who had given their life savings to the temple, and hundreds of children, were put to work from dawn until dusk, clearing land, building simple wooden cottages, and tending to the agricultural fields. For a time, a fragile sense of hope persisted. They were pioneers building a new world together. But the utopian dream quickly began to unravel under the weight of Jones's escalating paranoia and absolute control. Jonestown was not a cooperative community. It was a concentration camp disguised as a commune. The entire settlement was surrounded by armed guards. No one was allowed to leave. All communication with the outside world was heavily censored. Letters to and from relatives were read and edited by Jones's inner circle. Phone calls were monitored. The only source of news and information was Jim Jones himself. His voice was a constant, inescapable presence. He would broadcast his rambling, drug-fueled sermons over the settlement's loudspeaker system for hours on end, day and night. The residents were subjected to a relentless barrage of propaganda, a mixture of Marxist ideology, apocalyptic warnings, and self-aggrandizing pronouncements. He convinced them that the United States was descending into chaos, that fascists and the CIA were plotting to destroy them, and that he was their only protector, their dad, the sole arbiter of truth and salvation. Food was scarce and rationed, often consisting of little more than rice and beans, while Jones and his inner circle ate well. Medical care was primitive. The grueling physical labor and the psychological strain began to take their toll. But there was no escape. The jungle that surrounded them was as much a prison wall as any fence. Discipline became even more brutal than it had been in California. Those who questioned Jones's authority or were caught expressing a desire to leave were subjected to horrifying public punishments. They would be forced into a sensory deprivation box, a small, dark, underground enclosure, or drugged into a stupor with powerful tranquilizers. The most terrifying form of control, however, was the White Night. During a White Night, Jones would declare that their community was under imminent attack from outside forces. The entire population of Jonestown, over 900 people, would be roused from their beds in the middle of the night and ordered to assemble at the central pavilion. Armed guards would surround them. Jones, his voice filled with a mixture of rage and terror, would announce that their enemies, the CIA, racist mercenaries, the forces of capitalism, were closing in and that they had only one option left. He would tell them that it was time for revolutionary suicide, a final noble act of protest against a cruel and unjust world. He would then instruct them to line up and drink from a vat of red liquid, which he told them was laced with cyanide. It was a loyalty test of the most extreme kind. The followers, terrified and brainwashed, would watch as their friends and family members, including their own children, were forced to participate in these mock suicide drills. They would see people appearing to die, only to be told later that it was just a test of their faith. These rehearsals happened again and again, conditioning the people of Jonestown, normalizing the unthinkable, and breaking down their psychological resistance to the idea of mass suicide. They were being systematically prepared for a final act that Jones was beginning to see as inevitable. Back in the United States, the Concerned Relatives group was growing more desperate. They were receiving smuggled notes and fragmented reports from defectors that painted a horrifying picture of what was happening in the jungle. They knew their loved ones were being held against their will, and they pleaded with the U.S. government to intervene. Their primary ally was a California congressman named Leo Ryan. Ryan was a charismatic and crusading politician with a reputation for taking on difficult causes. He was known for his hands-on approach. He had once had himself committed to Folsom Prison to investigate prison conditions firsthand. When the Concerned Relatives came to him with their stories of Jonestown, he was moved by their plight and disturbed by the allegations. He decided he had to see the situation for himself. In November of 1978, despite warnings from the State Department, Congressman Leo Ryan announced that he would lead a fact-finding mission to Jonestown. He would be accompanied by several of his aides, a group of journalists from major news outlets like NBC and the San Francisco Chronicle, and several members of the Concerned Relatives. Jim Jones was initially resistant to the visit, but he knew that refusing a U.S. congressman would only increase suspicion and could provoke a more forceful intervention. He reluctantly agreed to allow the delegation to visit, hoping he could stage-manage the encounter and present Jonestown as the happy, thriving utopia he claimed it to be. On November 17, 1978, Leo Ryan and his delegation arrived at the small, remote airstrip at Port Kaituma, the closest point of entry to Jonestown. They were then transported by truck deep into the jungle. As they entered the settlement, they were greeted by a scene of carefully orchestrated joy. Hundreds of residents were gathered, singing and dancing. A lavish meal had been prepared. Jones himself, seated on a makeshift throne, welcomed the congressman. For the first few hours, the visit went according to Jones's plan. The journalists interviewed residents who spoke glowingly of their new life, and the settlement appeared to be a peaceful, if primitive, community. But as the evening wore on, the facade began to crack. During a celebration at the pavilion, a temple member secretly passed a note to one of the NBC newsmen. The note read, "Please help me get out of Jonestown." It was signed by two people. Soon, others began to quietly approach members of the delegation, whispering that they wanted to leave, that they were being held against their will. By the next morning, a group of about 15 Jonestown residents had formally requested to leave with the congressman. Jim Jones was furious. The defection of even a small number of his followers was a public relations disaster, a crack in the perfect image he had tried to present. His paranoia, always simmering just below the surface, now boiled over. He saw Ryan not as a fact-finder, but as an enemy who had come to destroy his paradise. As Ryan and his delegation prepared to leave with the defectors on the afternoon of November 18th, the atmosphere in Jonestown had turned from one of feigned hospitality to one of palpable, menacing tension. Jones's dream was collapsing, and the stage was now set for the final, catastrophic act of a tragedy that had been years in the making. The final hours at Jonestown on November 18th, 1978, were a chaotic and terrifying descent into madness. As Congressman Leo Ryan, his delegation, and the small group of defectors prepared to leave, the carefully constructed facade of the utopian community completely crumbled. Jim Jones, who had been observing the scene with a mixture of rage and desperation, saw the departure of even a handful of his followers as the ultimate betrayal, a public repudiation of his authority and his vision. In his drug-addled and paranoid mind, this was the beginning of the end he had long predicted. The enemies had finally arrived to destroy his paradise. As the group was boarding a large truck to take them back to the Port Kaituma airstrip, a loyal temple member suddenly attacked Congressman Ryan with a knife. The attack was quickly thwarted by Ryan's aides, and the delegation managed to get away, shaken but seemingly safe. They arrived at the small, remote airstrip and began to board two small chartered planes that were waiting to fly them back to civilization. But Jones had already set his final, deadly plan in motion. As the planes were preparing for takeoff, a tractor pulling a trailer filled with members of Jones's elite security force, the Red Brigade, roared onto the airstrip. They opened fire on the two planes with rifles and shotguns. The scene was one of absolute chaos and carnage. The delegation scrambled for cover, but there was nowhere to hide on the open tarmac. Congressman Leo Ryan was shot more than 20 times and killed, becoming the only U.S. congressman to be murdered in the line of duty. 3 journalists, NBC correspondent Don Harris, NBC cameraman Bob Brown, and San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, were also shot and killed as they tried to document the attack. One of the defectors, Patricia Parks, was also murdered. Many others were seriously wounded in the ambush. The gunmen continued to fire into the planes, ensuring no one could escape, before getting back on their tractor and driving back into the jungle. Back at the Jonestown settlement, as news of the airstrip massacre reached him, Jim Jones knew there was no turning back. He had murdered a U.S. congressman. The outside world would now descend upon him with its full force. He activated his final, most horrific plan. He called his followers to the central pavilion for the last time. His voice, broadcast over the loudspeakers, was no longer a mix of rage and paranoia. It was calm, resolute, and chillingly paternal. This was not a drill. This was the real White Knight. He told his followers what had happened at the airstrip. He told them that the world would not understand their revolutionary act and that enemy forces would soon be coming for them. "They'll come in here and they'll torture our children," he warned. "They'll torture our people. They'll torture our seniors." He presented them with a single, final option: to die with dignity, to commit a collective act of revolutionary suicide as a final protest against a cruel and inhumane world. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion, ensuring no one could escape. A large vat of grape-flavored Flavor Aid, often misidentified as Kool-Aid, was brought out. It had been mixed with a deadly cocktail of cyanide, Valium, and other sedatives. Jones instructed the parents to bring their children forward first. Syringes were used to squirt the poison into the mouths of the infants and small children. The pavilion was filled with the sounds of crying babies and the quiet sobs of parents who were being forced to murder their own children. One by one, the children died in their parents' arms. Then the adults were instructed to line up. Some went willingly, completely indoctrinated and believing they were making a noble sacrifice. Others were hesitant, terrified, but the armed guards, their own loyalty to Jones absolute, forced them forward. Christine Miller, a brave woman who had tried to argue against the suicide, was shouted down by the crowd. The pressure to conform was immense. They drank the poison from paper cups. The cyanide worked quickly, causing convulsions and a swift, agonizing death. For over an hour, the people of the People's Temple died, one by one. In total, 909 people died in Jonestown that day, over 300 of them children. It was the single largest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until the events of September 11, 2001. A few people managed to escape, hiding in the jungle until the chaos was over. A handful of others were in Georgetown, the capital of Guyana, on temple business. Jim Jones did not die by the poison he forced upon his followers. He was found dead on his throne at the head of the pavilion, with a single gunshot wound to the head. It is believed to have been a self-inflicted wound, though some have speculated he may have asked one of his most loyal followers to shoot him. He was found surrounded by the bodies of his inner circle, The final death toll, including those murdered at the airstrip, was 918. When Guyanese troops arrived at the settlement the next day, they were met with a scene of almost unimaginable horror. The ground around the pavilion was a carpet of bodies, lying side by side, many with their arms around each other in a final, tragic embrace. It was a silent, sprawling, open-air tomb. The utopia that Jim Jones had promised had become a death camp. The Jonestown Massacre sent a shockwave around the world. The story was so horrific, so bizarre, that it was difficult for the public to comprehend. How could over 900 people willingly participate in their own destruction? The word cult became a household term, and the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid entered the popular lexicon as a metaphor for blind, unquestioning belief. But the story of the People's Temple is more complex than a simple tale of brainwashed followers and a mad guru. It is a story about the power of hope and the danger of unchecked charisma. Jim Jones did not begin as a monster. He began as a champion of the poor and the marginalized. He offered a community, a sense of purpose, and a promise of a better world to people who had been let down by society. His followers were not fools. They were idealists. They were drawn in by the good works and the powerful message of equality. But over 2 decades, through a slow, methodical process of isolation, manipulation, fear, and psychological abuse, he stripped them of their critical thinking, their connections to the outside world, and their very sense of self. The tragedy of Jonestown is not just that 918 people died. It's that they died believing they were making a noble choice, a final act in a righteous struggle. Their deaths were the horrifying, logical conclusion of a journey that began with a promise of heaven on earth and ended in a man-made hell in the middle of the jungle. It stands as one of history's most stark and terrifying warnings about the dangers of surrendering one's will to a single, charismatic leader, and the catastrophic price that can be paid for the promise of paradise.